Okay, so hello everybody. Now it's on. I am Philipp Müller from the University of Göttingen in Germany, and today I would like to present you the paper identifying income and wealth per households in the euro area. I wrote this paper together with Tobias Schmidt from the Deutsche Bundesbank, from the research center of the Bundesbank, and we published that as a working paper in the Bundesbank discussion paper series. I would like to start with a short overview of what you have to expect from me. In this paper, we look at different measures of income and wealth poverty, and for that we use the Household Finance and Consumption Survey dataset from the European Central Bank for 15 euro area countries. And we are interested in the way in which specific definitions of income and wealth poverty affect the number of poor households in the euro area, as well as their socio-demographic characteristics and their portfolios. We use this HFCS dataset because it contains a lot of information on income and wealth, and that allows us to construct different indicators of poverty based on both income and wealth. As I already said, we want to analyze the socio-demographic structure and the portfolios of poor households depending on specific definitions of poverty. So we want to understand the relationship between different definitions of poverty and the structure and the financial situation of households in the euro area, because we think that this can support the discussion of what a good poverty measure for a specific research, or to be even more important, for a specific poverty question, policy question can be. So when you want to fight poverty as a policymaker in the first step, of course, you have to know how poverty looks like in your country. So, and I would like to start with the motivation for that. Poverty and inequality have become prominent topics in public discussion. That is definitely true, especially since the beginning of the financial crisis in 2008. I'm from Germany, and in Germany right now there's a big debate on poverty and inequality, and also especially with a focus on poverty of the elderly and poverty of retired persons. In an international context, of course, as well, just think of here Joseph Stiglitz or Amartya Sen, or in Europe, Europe 2020, target number 5, with a focus on poverty and social exclusion. We want at least 20 million fewer people in or at risk of poverty and social exclusion. And of course, the OECD takes care of that as well. The main focus of most research and in most public discussions is income poverty, not wealth poverty or assets. And there are some reasons for the missing of wealth in the poverty debate, or not the missing of wealth, but why income is very prominent. And one reason, of course, is that data describing the income of households is available for many countries, from many different sources, statistical agencies. While on the other hand, data describing the wealth holdings or assets of households, that has been relatively scarce. And for the euro area now, at least, the HFCS has changed that. Another question is, or another point is, that how you integrate wealth into a poverty definition. This is still an open question, because there is yet no generally accepted method for defining poverty based on wealth alone or on a combination of wealth and income. But nonetheless, we think that the number of poor households and the picture of poverty, that may depend on how poverty is defined. That brings us to the contribution of our paper. I already said that. We want to analyze the incidence and the socio-demographic structure, the portfolios and the consumption expenditure of poor households, depending on specific definitions of poverty. So we want to contribute to the debate on how to integrate wealth into a poverty definition. And so this is why we construct 5 different poverty indicators based on income and wealth. So I would like to start by explaining some concepts of poverty indicators and the literature on them. One indicator, or the classic poverty measure based on income, for example, exists. This is, in most cases, there is an income poverty line, and when that is 50 or 60% of the median income in the country, and when you have less than 50 or 60% of that median income, your household or the person is classified as poor. So this is a classical and widely accepted definition for income poverty. But what you can see here, one argument for including wealth into the poverty definition is from Brandolini, because income poverty measures, or pure income poverty measures, they ignore the possibility that a consumer unit decreases accumulated savings to meet current needs. That is true. For example, a household or a person can finance current needs with wealth or with savings, not only with income. Assume you win the lottery, in your country and you win 10 million in your local currency. Maybe you decide to stop working from that day on, then you would be classified as income poor, yeah, but nonetheless, your material standard of living should be higher than before, okay? And there are also some measures of, some joint measures of income and wealth poverty. We will see that on the next slide. And of course, there are also some measures of well-being of households beyond pure income or wealth measures, but this is not part of the presentation. Then there are two more different concepts, an integrated approach and a multidimensional approach. For the integrated approach, there you add an annuity value of wealth to income, so you bring income and wealth together for one single poverty measure. One paper is Weisbrot and Hansen from 1968, and I will talk about that later on, because that's what we did in our paper as well. I will explain later on how we implemented that. But there, when you want to do this, there are several assumptions necessary. For example, you have to think of an interest rate for the annuity factor, and you also have to calculate the remaining life expectancy. And on the other hand, the multidimensional approaches, there you assess the poverty independently for each indicator for both income and wealth, and then you combine these two things into one overall assessment of poverty. As I already said, there are of course a couple of papers dealing with this, but there is still no generally accepted approach how you can do this, or there is no generally accepted approach how it should definitely be done. So when you're interested in that, this is also a topic of future research. So next, I want to explain briefly the data set we use, the household finance and consumption survey data set that delivers comparable data on households finance for all euro area countries. And yeah, the aim of that is to collect harmonized micro-level data on households' assets and liabilities. And the survey is conducted by the national central banks of the euro area system, of course, under the same guidelines and supervised by the European Central Bank. The coverage, it covers all euro area countries except for Ireland and Estonia. So we are talking about the results of the first wave of the HFCS. The second wave has been, there was a second wave, I think the results will be published at the beginning of the next year. So, and Ireland and Estonia, they are not included in the first wave, but they will be included from the second wave on. So yeah, the countries included are, most surveys were did in 2010, and the included countries are Austria, Belgium, Germany, France, Italy, Cyprus, Luxembourg, Malta, Portugal, Slovenia and Slovakia. That was in 2010, and some other countries even started earlier, for example, Greece and the Netherlands and Finland in 2009 and Spain in 2008. What I would like to say about that is that just when you think of 2008 or 2009, that is definitely too early to cover long-run effects of the financial crisis. When the next wave of the HFCS is released, as I said, I think at the beginning of the next year we can see or we can observe the results of the financial crisis in these countries. That could be interesting. The sample size, it is a pretty big sample that contains more than 61,000 households from all the 15 euro area countries. So yeah, of course, and we use it because the data set contains a lot of detailed information on assets, on income, on debt, for example, real assets, real estates, vehicles, valuable savings, bonds, really all kinds of assets. So then in the next step, I would like to show you the 5 poverty indicators we have developed or we use. We use the literature to identify poor households and define 5 poverty indicators, and we calculate them for the euro area as a whole, as well as for each individual country. So the first indicator is the classic income poverty measure. So the household is classified as poor when the gross equivalized annual household income is below 60% of the median in the country. So when the household has less than 60% of the median income, you're poor. And gross income includes labor income, income from pensions, transfer income, and something called other income. Well, this is a minor drawback. The HFCS does not contain information on net wealth, only on gross wealth. This is why we use gross wealth. And the second indicator we use, this is a combined measure of income and net wealth. And here a household is poor when the income and the net wealth, when this combined, is below 60% of the median of that in a country. So the household is poor when income and net wealth is below 60% of income and net wealth in the country. And for the calculation, net wealth means real wealth, real plus financial assets minus the outstanding liabilities. And that value, that wealth value is multiplied with an annuity factor, as I already said, that annuity factor, when you want to calculate it, there are several assumptions you have to think of, for example, the life expectancy and the interest rate. That's what I want to show you on the next slide. So these are the formulas, not the formulas for net wealth, these are the formulas for the annuity factor we use. And there are two different possibilities now. The first possibility is that we have a single household, so a household with just one household head, or when both spouses have the same life expectancy, of course, that doesn't happen very often, then this annuity factor is calculated as follows: r over 1 minus 1 plus r to the power of minus n. And here r is the interest rate and n is the remaining life expectancy. And the life expectancy is calculated as follows: assume you are, 40 years old, and the average life expectancy in your country for your sex is 75, then the remaining life expectancy n would be 35. And as an interest rate, we assumed 4% because this is in line with some other papers, for example, from Weisbrot and Hansen and Lerman and Mixel. And yeah, these formulas are also taken from the paper from Weisbrot and Hansen. They were the first one who did this. And then what's even more realistic, when both spouses have different life expectancies, then this annuity factor is calculated as follows: r over 1 minus 1/3 times 1 plus r to the power of minus n minus 2/3 times 1 plus r to the power of minus n. And here m is the higher remaining life expectancy and n is the lower remaining life expectancy. So of course one spouse has a higher life expectancy than the other, okay? So data on life expectancy, by the way, that is taken from Eurostat. And as I said, this is a combined measure of income and poverty, of income and wealth. So you bring income and wealth together to one indicator. And for the calculation of the wealth part of that, you have, as I said, the wealth value, real assets, financial assets minus outstanding liabilities, and that is multiplied with that annuity factor, okay? So, and that means that wealth value, that is the sum that could be spent each year so that all the wealth is consumed when you die. So the assumption is that at your dying day, all the wealth is consumed and nothing is left, okay? So then there are three more poverty indicators we use, and I want to explain them briefly. Indicator 3 is income and net liquid assets. That is actually calculated in the same way as indicator 2. So here we use net liquid assets instead of net wealth. And net liquid assets, that is deposits, funds, bonds, stocks, non-self-employed business wealth, and managed accounts, and you subtract the non-collateralized debt. We do this because we think that liquid assets, they are more easily available to substitute a potential loss in income or an income shock. For example, you lose your work and you need money, then selling net liquid assets, that's easier than, for example, selling your house, okay? And indicator 4 and 5, these are multidimensional poverty indicators. Indicator 4 is income and wealth. And here a household is poor when it has less than 60% of the median income in the country, so the classic income poverty measure, and on top is in the bottom decile, so one of the last 10% of the net wealth distribution, so these two assumptions. And we do this because the bottom decile, the last 10%, that allows us to look at groups of similar size in each country, last 10%. And the last indicator, indicator 5, this is income or wealth, a combined measure again. And here the household is poor according to the definition when it is income poor, below 60% of the median income in the country, or when it belongs to the bottom decile of the net wealth distribution. Only one of these two conditions has to be fulfilled. And they are calculated in the paper, but no, they are not a part of that presentation here. I want to focus on the other indicators because that would. I'm almost running out of time now. So here you see a correlation matrix. You see correlation between the income poverty measure, indicator 1, and the other two indicators. So the table shows the correlations between indicator 1 and indicator 2, and the correlation between indicator 1 and indicator 3. And what you see is that all the correlations are actually rather high. It's always more than 0.7, and the table also shows that the measures based on income and on net, the measures based on income and net liquid assets. So indicator 3 is highly correlated with the classic income poverty measure. And that means that those households that are classified as income poor, they are also income and net liquid assets poor. So, What we see generally is that the correlation coefficients, they are comparable across countries. That means for the first, and the correlation between the first and the second indicator, it's always between 0.7 and 0.75, and for the first and the third indicator, it's almost a little bit more than 0.94. Good. So then I would like to show you our main results. I start by presenting statistics on the share and the number of households defined as poor according to the first 3 poverty indicators. And then in the second part, I will analyze some socio-demographic characteristics of poor households. So this is the part about poverty and the elderly. And then if there's enough time, I will talk about some portfolios and consumptions. This table shows the share of poor households in each country that are classified as poor according to our poverty definitions. For example, this 23% means that in the euro area, 23% of the households are classified as poor according to the income poverty measure. So they have less than 60% of the medium income, or 14%. This means that 40% are poor according to the second poverty indicator. So what we can see when we look at the first poverty indicator, almost all countries have shares of between 19 and 25 or 26%, except for 3 outliners. And then when we add wealth to the poverty definition, when we go to indicator 2, this leads to a big reduction in the poverty rates in all the countries. Well, then the poverty rates are between 10 and 15% in most countries. And of course, the extent of the reduction differs between the countries, but there is definitely a big reduction. And then when we exclude wealth and include net liquid assets, so when we go to indicator 3, the poverty rates, they go back up almost to the level of the first indicator. And that shows that excluding or including wealth into the calculation of a poverty definition, that really plays an important role. Okay, as I already said, when we compare the countries for each of the indicators, the picture is relatively the same. For the first indicator, the shares are almost always between 20, 25, 26%, and then that rate goes down. That rate goes down for the second indicator, and then it goes up again for the third indicator. We also can see that the crisis countries have almost similar poverty rates than the other countries. For example, Portugal, Greece, or Cyprus, or Spain. But I also mentioned that the survey in Greece was in 2009 and in Spain in 2008, and that was to it is too early to cover long-run effects of the financial crisis, and that will be interesting when the second wage is released. Okay, then now comes the interesting part about poverty and elderly. We analyzed socio-demographic characteristics of poor households in our paper for the first 2 poverty indicators. So that means for the income poverty measure and for the income and wealth poverty measure, because the first one, the income poverty measure, is the most widely used one, and the second integrates wealth. And I want to explain that. This is what I want to explain you right now. So when we talk about the first indicator, the income poverty indicator, we see that the age of the reference person, the age of the household head, has a U-shaped impact on the probability of being poor. And that means that young household heads and old household heads, they are affected by poverty the most. So young persons and old persons are affected by poverty the most. And we also see that the household heads in income poor households, that household head is older than the average household head. So that definitely shows that income poverty, that is a problem of the elderly, and especially in southern European countries. And we also see that the percentage of retired household heads is higher among the poor compared to the overall population. So a really big extent of retired persons is income poor. And that means that income poverty is definitely a problem of old and retired persons. Then when we go to the second indicator, when we move from the pure income measure to the income and wealth measure, the poverty rates decline. So older persons are more affected by income poverty than by wealth poverty. And we can see that the average age of the household head is lower than for indicator 1, and the average age of the household head is even lower than in the overall population. And that shows that wealth poor households are young and not old. So wealth poverty is a problem of young households, not of old households. And that can be explained by the so-called life cycle hypothesis. That means that old households have saved a part of their income during their lifetime, and they have bought assets, and they consume these assets when they're old. And that makes it possible for them to escape poverty. If I want to sum this up, so income poverty is really high among old persons and retired persons. This is a problem. But when we include wealth to the poverty definition, the poverty rates fall for old people, you know. So I said that. What we see here, this is the participation rate in real assets, in financial assets, in debt, and for wealth-poor households, but not for the entire sample, only for big and for crisis countries. This reads as follows. For example, 84% means that 84% of households that are poor according to indicator 1 have real assets, and here that 74% of households that are poor according to indicator 2 have real assets. So we only did this for the big countries and for the crisis countries, and the number in the brackets that shows the difference in percentage points between poor households and the overall population. So when we look at real assets, we see that in all countries, poor households are underrepresented in real assets. In case of the second indicator, the values are a little bit lower. On a way, this is not surprising because when you want to buy real assets, that usually requires savings or income to pay that. And when we look at the participation in financial assets, then we see that poor households are less affected by financial asset poverty than real asset poverty. So, and what is also very interesting, when we look at debt, we see that we have no country here for which the share of poor households with debt is higher than for the population at large. So poor households don't have more debt. Then the last point I want to talk about, this is poverty and consumption. We wanted to investigate the consumption behavior of poor households because we think that one very important channel through which wealth and well-being can be linked is consumption, because consumption can be both financed by income and wealth, and a household with wealth or with assets can have a higher material standard of living than when we only look at income. As I already said, assume you win the lottery in your country, you win 10 million, then you decide to stop working, then you would be income poor, but the material standard of living would be way higher. So we assume that the consumption levels should differ. At the beginning we assumed that consumption levels should differ depending on whether we include wealth or not. As one minor drawback, only food consumption is available in the Household Finance and Consumption Survey, no other consumption. So we investigate how food consumption differs when we change between different poverty indicators. And that reads as follows. For example, when we look at Austria, the blue bar, that means that those households that are classified as income poor spend about maybe 34% of their income on food, and that households that are classified as income and net wealth poor spend about 35 or 36% of their income on food. In the larger euro areas, we see that the share of food expenditure on income is about maybe 1/3, and a couple of countries spend more than 50% on that. The most is spent in Slovakia. But what was surprising for us is that the definition of poverty, it looks like it doesn't really matter much because food consumption is a share of income that remains almost the same. The biggest difference maybe you see here for Slovakia, that is maybe 8 percentage points. That's it. Okay. And then to draw the conclusion, so we have looked at different measures of income and wealth poverty, and we have seen that when we add wealth to the poverty definition, that influences the share of poor households. As I've said, the effect on the effect on food consumption was very limited, but we see effect on the socio-demographics. And with respect to poverty and elderly, we see that income poverty is definitely a problem of the elderly. Income poverty is very high among old persons and retired persons, and but on the other hand, wealth poverty doesn't really seem to be so problematic. Old persons are more affected by income poverty, not by wealth poverty, and old persons consume their assets when they are retired, and that allows them to escape poverty. Okay, that was the presentation.